días, good morning everybody. You have this for translations, okay? Buenos días a todo el mundo. Vamos a hablar en castellano en esta primera parte. We are going to speak in Spanish, these 15 minutes. So, just for your information, you have this thing, I don't know the name in English. Number 1 is for Spanish translations, and number 2 for English translations. So, British English people in general use that in the first moment, okay? Buenos días a todo el mundo. Es un placer y un honor daros la bienvenida a este congreso. Es un congreso, después iré con más detalle, que empezó originalmente como algo más que una pequeña reunión interna de trabajo de un proyecto y al final se ha convertido en un gran congreso, en mayúsculas. Por tanto, estamos muy contentos y contentas de que estéis hoy aquí. Ahora la estructura será la siguiente. Primero, el profesor Joan Botella, decano de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociología, va a hacer una primera presentación. Después, el profesor Xavier Bonal, director del grupo de investigación ABJOVES, que es en el marco del cual se ha desarrollado el proyecto y el congreso, y jefe de departamento de Sociología, dirá unas cuantas palabras. Después yo volveré a decir algo sobre la organización del congreso y empezaremos con la ponencia inaugural a cargo de la profesora Diane Reay. Deciros también que podemos hablar de forma fluida, pero para ayudar a los traductores y traductoras está bien que todos y todas intentemos hablar a un ritmo tranquilo para que faciliten la traducción. En las intervenciones del público en los diferentes momentos también habrá traducción, por tanto que todo el mundo se sienta tranquilo de intervenir en inglés o en español. Thank you very much for coming.
Muchas gracias. Buen día, buenos días, good morning everybody. Y bienvenidos a la apertura de este congreso, ABJOVES, y bienvenidos a la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociología de esta universidad. Estamos encantados de acogerles a ustedes aquí. Sepan que nos ha dado mucho tiempo, mucho trabajo la preparación de este congreso, especialmente conseguir que haya dejado de llover y que el sol brille. Ha sido un esfuerzo especialmente dedicado a nuestros colegas británicos, que pueden tal vez confirmar tópicos acerca de lo que ocurre en España. El tema del Congreso versa sobre un tópico que alguien ha calificado recientemente de si hubiera que ocuparse de una cuestión, habría que ocuparse de esta. ¿Qué es lo que ocurre en la juventud? ¿Qué es lo que ocurre entre los colectivos de jóvenes que no se ajustan al funcionamiento de los mecanismos establecidos de transición desde la infancia a la adolescencia, de la adolescencia a la juventud, desde la formación hasta el mercado de trabajo? Oímos con frecuencia el término fracaso, pero nunca está claro el adjetivo. ¿Quién fracasa? ¿Fracasa el estudiante? ¿Fracasa la escuela? ¿Fracasa el mercado de trabajo? ¿Fracasa la sociedad? ¿Cuál es el responsable de este desajuste, de estos fenómenos de desajuste, que como leemos en clave generacional, hay que pensar que luego esto se traduce en términos de perspectiva cronológica? Aquello que hoy se construya mal va a ser aquello que esté vigente en el futuro, de tal manera que si hay algo relevante dentro de lo que nos pasa hoy, es justamente cómo estamos construyendo el mañana. La centralidad de la cuestión se manifiesta en algo muy simple, que es la presencia aquí de investigadores, de especialistas de distintos departamentos, de distintas especialidades, gente de sociología, de educación, de antropología o de estudios políticos, que se sienten concernidos por esta problemática. Yo creo que esto no hace más que celebrar, subrayar la centralidad de la cuestión y dar sentido al hecho de que en términos institucionales, académicos e intelectuales, estas distintas comunidades convivan en la misma institución con nuestra facultad. No quiero añadir nada
director del Departamento de Sociología, es un placer para mí darles la bienvenida a este fantástico seminario internacional organizado desde el Grupo de Investigación, Globalización, Educación y Políticas Sociales, y en concreto desde el proyecto ABJOVES y de su brillante e incansable directora, Diane. Me hace especial ilusión darles la bienvenida y también dirigirles unas palabras como director también de nuestro grupo de investigación, el ABJOVES, un grupo especialmente activo en los últimos años y con gente altamente implicada y motivada por lo que hace, que no es poco en los momentos, como saben, en los que transcurre la vida de la universidad. En el ABJOVES realizamos una investigación educativa desde una perspectiva crítica y con un enfoque basado en la justicia social, y con un claro objetivo de transferir los resultados de nuestro trabajo a la mejora de los procesos educativos y sociales y en particular a la mejora de la política educativa. Creo que la participación en este seminario, no solo de investigadores y académicos, sino de profesionales de la administración educativa, de fundaciones educativas, de sindicatos y del propio profesorado del sistema educativo, creo que son una buena muestra de este interés por la transferencia de los resultados. He podido seguir muy de cerca la evolución del proyecto ABJOVES y creo que este seminario es un escenario idóneo para comprobar los extensos y buenos resultados del mismo. La investigación sobre abandono escolar prematuro, como saben, empieza a ser notable en España y no digamos ya a nivel internacional. Sin embargo, creo que el proyecto ABJOVES aporta una mirada nueva al tema. Una mirada centrada no en los factores explicativos del abandono escolar, de lo que hay mucha investigación ya, sino en las condiciones sociales generadoras del riesgo de abandono. Se trata de una mirada que pone énfasis, por lo tanto, en los mecanismos sociales que lo desencadenan. Una mirada, por lo tanto, que es necesariamente cualitativa y etnográfica, que permita acceder a la comprensión de los fenómenos sociales de una forma dinámica. Se evidencia de este modo que las desigualdades no son un simple resultado estático, sino un proceso que se forma de manera compleja y en el que intervienen la clase, el género o el origen étnico como materia prima con la que se construyen determinadas subjetividades en unas condiciones concretas. Creo que es fundamental reconocer la importancia de este tipo de investigación para la política educativa. Seguimos en un sistema en el que las intervenciones públicas o bien se improvisan y se construyen desde una especie de wishful thinking, o bien seleccionan un determinado tipo de evidencia a partir de modelos experimentales o cuasi experimentales para tomar decisiones políticas. Se olvida de este modo y se aparta cómo determinadas políticas o no funcionan o solo funcionan para algunos grupos sociales y no para otros. La aproximación del proyecto ABJOVES y de las aportaciones que se realizarán en este seminario creo que son un ejemplo de que la aproximación etnográfica no solo es válida para informar a la política, sino para aportar una mirada que solo consigue traer la exploración de la interacción entre factores objetivos y subjetivos. Seguir desarrollando políticas y programas que ignoren esta mirada difícilmente permite actuar sobre la raíz de por qué algunos alumnos abandonan los estudios o por qué fracasan en la escuela. Creo que este seminario constituye, pues, una excelente oportunidad no solo para el intercambio académico, sino para la reivindicación de un tipo de investigación social ignorada por la política. Estoy seguro de que la calidad de los trabajos que se van a presentar así lo hará evidente. Y solo me queda de nuevo felicitar a Inaugurational y a todo el equipo ABJOVES y darles la bienvenida de nuevo a todos los participantes en este magnífico seminario. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Joan, Xavier. Antes de dar la palabra a la profesora Reay, sí que me gustaría hacer unos cuantos agradecimientos también que son imprescindibles en un congreso como este. Como os comentaba antes, este seminario, este congreso, se pensó originalmente como el evento de clausura de un proyecto de investigación que venimos desarrollando en los últimos 3 años. Es un proyecto que, como decíamos, hemos coordinado desde el JEX, pero en el que hay investigadores e investigadoras de diversas comunidades autónomas del Estado y, por tanto, el primer agradecimiento imprescindible es para los colegas que forman parte del proyecto ABJOVES. No nos conocíamos cuando empezamos esta investigación y creo que hoy puedo decir que, aparte de colegas investigadores, somos también amigos y, por tanto, ha sido un placer colaborar con vosotros estos años. En segundo lugar, deciros que cuando decidimos plantear un proyecto sobre temas de abandono escolar, y esto lo decía Joan y lo decía también Xavier, una de las razones principales por las cuales seleccionamos este tema fue porque el abandono escolar es uno de los elementos claves de desigualdad y de reproducción de desigualdades sociales en nuestra sociedad. No se puede abordar el abandono escolar sin tener en cuenta una perspectiva de la equidad social y educativa y, por tanto, es un placer que hoy haya tanta gente interesada en estudiar, reflexionar y hablar de un tema de esta magnitud. En tercer lugar, un agradecimiento especial, en primer lugar, a los 4 ponentes invitados. Es un honor contar con ellos a lo largo de todo el seminario, y un agradecimiento a la gran variedad de perfiles que están representados en esta conferencia. Para mí es un placer especial saber que contamos no solo con académicos y académicas, sino también con representantes de la administración local, con directores, con profesores, y es especialmente relevante saber que miembros, docentes y de equipos directivos de los centros educativos que han formado parte de este trabajo etnográfico que comentaba Xavier están hoy aquí. Es muy gratificante para nosotros haber conseguido esta interacción con ellos. A continuación, mi más sincero agradecimiento al comité organizador. Deciros que buena parte del trabajo y organización de este congreso se ha hecho por amor al arte. Ahora os voy a decir los nombres y apellidos de las personas que forman parte de este comité organizador. Todos y todas sabemos, sobre todo los que estamos en el ámbito académico, que la universidad últimamente es especialmente competitiva, individualizadora y marcada por las corrientes neoliberales que caracterizan nuestros tiempos. Esto genera, entre otras cosas, una presión muy grande por publicar, y publicar solo allí donde es reconocido. Nuestro comité organizador está formado por gente que está haciendo tesis, másters y estudiantes también de sociología, que han hecho esto sin ningún reconocimiento social, público o de impacto. Por tanto, es un placer y es un privilegio poder contar con ellos. Tenemos a Judith Jakowskis, aquí sentada, Alejandro Montes, Clara Fandavila, Marta Curran, Alba Castejón y también Martín Manzano, que está afuera. Por tanto, para todos ellos un agradecimiento especial. Finalmente, deciros que en el espíritu de este congreso, la organización ha contado con muchas colaboraciones especiales. Para las traducciones tenemos a los estudiantes y las estudiantes de la Facultad de Interpretación de aquí de la universidad. Por tanto, darles las gracias. Para los cafés, las bebidas, los bocadillos, las pausas, contamos con la colaboración de Linda, que está allí su directora. El Linda es una escuela de segunda oportunidad, de las más comprometidas con la igualdad de oportunidades educativas de los y las jóvenes, y por tanto, contar con ellos para este servicio nos parece de especial importancia. Y finalmente, deciros también que las personas que están aquí fuera haciendo el pesado trabajo de inscripciones, etcétera, son todos estudiantes de tercero y cuarto de sociología, voluntarios, y por tanto aquí la voluntad de todos está jugando un papel muy importante en que esto sea posible. Por tanto, nada más, gracias a todo el mundo de nuevo. Ahora sí que empezaremos con la ponencia de Diane Reay. Yo me voy a pasar al inglés para introducirla y, por tanto, de nuevo, gracias a todo el mundo.
Many thanks for inviting me. It's lovely to be here in the sunshine. Working class educational failure, including the problems of early school leaving, has haunted the English educational system since it began over 100 years ago. Too often, the subject is seen in terms of deficit working class culture and inadequate learners. In this talk, I argue that working class educational failure is a complex mixture of history, geography, class identities, institutional policies and practices, and the relationships between classes, as well as the experiences and dispositions between them. I argue that early school leaving is an extreme manifestation of the predominantly negative relationship that the English working classes have to their educational system, one that still positions them as outsiders on the inside, even when they manage to continue on to higher education. In the process of trying to unpick this policy and practice minefield, I also consider the invidious influence of dominant discourses about social class, as well as the difficult, sometimes painful issues of researching educational failure with those who are seen to have failed. In order to understand early school leaving, we need to first conceptualise schools as places of educational reproduction and spaces of othering, as places that are not straightforwardly about teaching and learning, but as sites of racialised, gendered and classed cultures of inclusion and exclusion. And the sociologist of education who allows us the most insightful understandings of educational inclusions and exclusions is Pierre Bourdieu. And here, together with Passeron, he argues that the dominant thrust of the imposition of the dominant culture as legitimate culture, and by the same token of the illegitimacy of the cultures of the dominated classes and groups, comes from exclusion, which perhaps is the most symbolic force when it assumes the guise of self-exclusion. Processes of symbolic violence are endemic in the contemporary English educational system. Bourdieu argues that the dominant only let the system they dominate take its own course in order to exercise their domination. But our current political elite are engaged in a restructuring of the educational system, a re-traditionalising of the curriculum, and the reintroduction of policies that work to reinscribe the working classes as educational losers. I'm going to draw on a case study from my own research that uses Bourdieu's theory in order to understand the workings of educational exclusion. I'm going to talk about methodological approaches later, but I believe very strongly that we need to bring working class young people's narratives to life, and that one way of doing this is to devote a lot of time and reflexivity in order to develop in-depth case studies. The example from my own research I'm going to talk about is Sean, who I interviewed 7 times over a period of 3 years. And Sean's story is one of a hard-working, well-behaved, poor, white, working-class boy who's trying to achieve academically, first in a predominantly working-class, multi-ethnic primary school, and then in what we call a SINC, in a city boys' comprehensive school, while simultaneously trying to maintain his standing within the male peer group culture. And despite his many efforts and struggles, Sean ends up leaving school at 16 with minimal qualifications. And in the analysis, because I want to make sense of Sean's psychic struggles as well as his educational trajectory, I use the concept of habitus as well as those of capital and field. I wanted to understand how structures become embodied and generate ambivalences and tensions in new fields. But his tale also speaks to the difficulty that haunts many early school leavers, that of managing movement across two different and at times opposing fields, those of the classroom and the working class peer culture. And here he talks about, in the classroom, I'm not myself. I'm totally different. I'm hard-working. And out in the playground, I'm back to my usual self, wanting to fight and just be normal. However, there's a great deal of struggle and conflict, and Sean's narrative illustrates the difficulty of reconciling white working-class masculinities with educational success in inner-city working-class schooling. And throughout his narrative, we see that combining the two generates heavy psychic costs, involving him not only in an enormous amount of academic labour, but also an intolerable burden of psychic reparative work. And Bourdieu writes about the comfortable ease of habitus in familiar fields and uses the metaphor of a fish in water, those who are able to take the world around them for granted, swimming without having to consider how to swim. But Sean's tale is one of floundering rather than swimming, of being weighted down rather than being weightless. And he's positioned on the boundaries of two irreconcilable ways of being and has to produce an exhaustive body of psychic, intellectual and interactive work in order to maintain his contradictory ways of being. And we gain a sense of how blurred the lines are between psychic and social processes. The position in which Sean finds himself is one of struggle between two conflicting social fields, whereas Nicola Ingram has written about in her research, habitus is tugged and pulled in different directions. And I'd argue in this quote here we have a clear exemplification of Bourdieu's divided habitus, caught between two very different but equally compelling fields. Sean is situated at a point where the contradictions between white working class male solidarity and the neoliberal impulses to self-improvement and academic excellence are painfully apparent. And this has resulted in a heightened emotional sensitivity in order to cope with these conflicts. And by the end of Sean's first year at secondary school, the two conflicting aspects of his identity are beginning to fall apart. And he says it's getting much harder. Like a couple of my friends, they go, "Oh, you're the teacher's pet." But I have to do my work. And yet at the same time, he doesn't want to fall out with his friends. And this double bind inscribed in Sean's educational enterprise is at the heart of a system of dispositions divided against itself. Intense loyalty to class and community is at odds with individual striving for success. And Sean has to engage in a punishing process of self-regulation in the face of his desires to be one of the boys. And the toll this has taken is evident in Sean's longing to be a baby again. And he says, "I wish I was younger now, just sleep in my cot and have no responsibility." And evident in Sean's words is the suffering that can be generated by what Bourdieu calls a destabilised habitus, torn by contradictions and internal divisions. And I did 4 interviews with Sean when he was at secondary school, and you can see a complex mixture of ambivalence, defensiveness and pride that make up his divided habitus. And he says Sutton Boys isn't the best school in the area, but it ain't the worst. And he said other kids diss it, say it's full of tramps, but they don't really know what it's like. And in the last interview, he said, I don't know what to do about my friends. They just muck about all the time. I'm just exhausted trying to keep it all together. And here, and in the earlier quote about wanting to be a baby again, we see the heavy psychological toll that managing two conflicting fields exerts on Sean. Habitus is being stretched to the limit as Sean attempts to reconcile the increasingly irreconcilable. And in the end, the struggle between educational success and working class peer group pressure becomes too much. And Sean left school at 16 when all his friends did. And I want to argue from this case study that early school leaving is never an easy process. And often when we take the time and effort to elicit its roots and causes through in-depth case studies, what are revealed are extremely complex, highly emotional processes that are often very difficult and painful for the young person involved. Deborah Udell's research on excluded students in Australia and the UK provides further insights into educational exclusions. Her book, Impossible Bodies, Impossible Selves, Exclusions and Student Subjectivities, presents a powerful picture of educational inclusions and inclusions, and the gendered, class and racialised inequalities that underpin them. For Udell, what a student is in terms of gender, sexuality, social class, ability, disability, race, ethnicity and gender and religion, as well as popular and subcultural belongings, is inextricably linked with the sort of student or learner that he gets to be, and the educational inclusions he enjoys, and the exclusions that he faces. For Udell, educational inclusions and exclusions are constructed through dominant discourses that come together in ways that create truths about students as learners. And one result of these processes is that some aspects of identity, say white middle-class female, come to be seen as synonymous with the ideal learner, who is thereby set up for educational success. However, other identity markers, such as working class and male, work to close down the possibilities of educational success. In Udell's terms, they are positioned as impossible learners. And she devotes a whole chapter to Paul, a white working class male student with emotional and behavioural difficulties, whose behaviour in the classroom is so excessive, insulting other students, disobeying instructions, and occasionally storming out, that Udell argues he's no longer constituted as special, as in having special educational needs, but rather is made inaudible. He is seen as both an impossible learner and an impossible subject, and in the end is excluded from school. And I would argue that the early school leaver is constituted as an impossible learner. In the UK, a market-driven, privatised educational system that operates with a crude, test-led culture of attributing value has resulted in the devaluation and pathologisation of many working-class students, particularly those who are not predicted the average results or above in our national exams taken at age 15, 16. It's also resulted in the devaluing and demonisation of schools, mostly comprehensives, that these working class students attend. We do not need to scrutinise research reports to recognise the low esteem and contempt with which such schools and their students are widely regarded. Reading national and local press but also spending any concerted time with groups of white middle-class parents, we will reveal a litany of failures and lacks in which words like rubbish, bad, sink and rough proliferate. Much has been written about middle-class choice-making, including middle-class avoidance strategies of these sink schools. But there is far less work on the repercussions for working-class students of this stigmatisation of themselves and the schools they attend. They automatically become losers in an increasingly competitive educational game. So growing processes of polarisation and segregation, caused largely by white middle-class choice, are fuelling early school leaving by positioning working-class students in demonised, stigmatised educational places. And in these following two quotes, you can see the negative repercussions for working-class learner identities. So George, a white working-class boy, says, if you don't get into any of the good schools, they send you to one of the rubbish schools. And he said, I've heard people saying in school, I hope I don't go to Chiltern, which is the school he's in. So then I thought that was really awful, because all the kids there are bad and no good at learning. And in this next quote, Tayfik, a Turkish working class student, says Deer Park is still going to be rubbish, there are still the same students, and the students are crap. In a recent research project I conducted from 2010 to 13, the constraints and difficulties surrounding working class educational experiences were ever present. And the research also illustrates the seeds of early school leaving as being generated in the practices and the pedagogies of the schools, as much as they lie in the dispositions of working class habitus. So I'm talking about a large working class comprehensive school in a town in the southeast of England. And we focus particularly on white working class and minority ethnic working class students at risk of educational failure. So those the school has identified as most likely to drop out. And the students we interviewed in individual interviews and focus groups were unambiguously working class. And what the interviews showed was that these young people, despite being disadvantaged and from poor families, were good neoliberal subjects, buying heavily into processes of individualisation and free choice. And like young working class people in the 60s, 70s and 80s, for whom early school leaving was not seen as an individual failure, these young people had very high aspirations that were in conflict with their actual labour market possibilities. And neoliberal attitudes also permeated their views about learning, and in particular a very powerful sense of individual responsibility for learning and, in their case, failing to achieve educational success. So students told us, it's all down to the individual how well you do at school. You have to make yourself stand out compared to all the other people doing the same exams. If you want to do well, you just have to work really, really hard. You can't blame the school or your teachers. So these young people were very heavily invested in notions of the autonomous, self-reliant individual, primarily responsible for any future outcomes. And we can glimpse the way in which symbolic domination works through processes of individualisation. Yet their strong sense of individual responsibility for learning was coupled with weak, often disengaged learner identities. And it's vital to acknowledge the importance of history and wider context for this sense of having spoiled learner identity. The dominant discourses that constitute the working classes as as inadequate failing learners has changed very little in the UK over 100 years. It's unsurprising then that working class students continue to see the relevance of, in particular, the academic subjects they're studying. And what we found in our research that learning out of school was seen to be both more rewarding and relevant than school-based learning. And as a consequence, a large number of the people we interviewed specified that the most important and enjoyable thing about school was being with friends, rather than any aspect of their learning. So Maya said, when asked what she most enjoyed about school, said, my friends. And Satvinder said, the best thing about coming to school is meeting my friends. We can also see the damaging impact on learner identities of being allocated to bottom sets. So Joe says, the behaviour is bad, you don't learn unless you're in the top set. And Sula said, the behaviour gets worse in the bottom set because the teachers then don't pay any attention to you. They only pay attention to the higher ability students. And then we have this quote from Attic, and he said, I was completely failed. I think I failed proper badly in the test, and that's why I'm in a proper bad state now. And he goes on to say, so I've just become rubbish. And in both quotes, low sets are clearly seen to be coterminous with educational failure. However, it's Satvinder, in her lamentation about being a bottom set student, who makes most explicit the damage done to already tenuous learner identities. And she talks about being in the bottom set for everything, which means she's only doing the foundation papers and can't get the top grades in her exams. And she said, I really didn't want to do that. And then I thought, very poignantly, she says, I could have gone to a better, higher place, and then I could have done everything. And I said, and now? And she said, there is no hope. Yet, paradoxically, the young people's accounts challenge any assumption that they're not interested in learning. Rather, learning out of school would seem to be most rewarding and more relevant than their school-based learning. And we found that these young people, who often had ambivalent learner identities at school, succeeded in creating supportive social networks and acquired social and cultural capital outside of school. And it was in describing the many and varied activities they engaged in out of school that they began to convey a sense of passion, motivation and critical engagement that was missing from most of their school learning. So Ricky talks about his adventurous side, which is expressed not through the schools and that he's attended, but through the many activities that he does outside of school. And here he's talking about making things with his hands. And he said, when I was about 8 or 9, I made a bicycle out of wood by myself. And then when I was 10, I built a cupboard. Well, me and my dad built a cupboard out of wood and stuff like that for over our stairs, so we could put our towels in it. And that was when I was 10, and it's still up there now. In the following extract, he talks about his latest outing with the Air Cadets. And it's clear that among the excitement and fun involved, there's also a great deal of learning in process, academic as well as more practical aspects. And he talks about controlling the plane, but he also talks, as well as talking about flying it, about gravity. And he talks about how he starts to understand what gravity actually means. And then there's Xian, who's also a member of Air Cadets. And she talks about passing the exams, and talks about one of the exams being on engineering of flying and principles of flying. and by the time of the second interview, she's passed this test to become a senior cadet and spoke with excitement and enthusiasm, not only about flying, but the science underpinning it. Yet when I asked her about school-based science, she said, "I hate it, it's boring." Rather, these young people with ambivalent and tenuous learner identities in school manage to nurture interests, talents and valued identities in their activities out of school. And a possible clue to this disjuncture between enjoyment and engagement in out-of-school activities and an instrumentalised accommodation to school-based learning lies in the very different discourses that underpin their description of out-of-school activities to those that they use to describe learning in their schools. Out-of-school activities are perceived to be characterised by collaboration and collectivity as much, if not more, than competition. So a key ingredient to Ricky's enjoyment in making things is that he shares the activity with his father. And being an air cadet is also centrally about being part of a team, about cooperation rather than individualised competition. But school, in contrast, is seen to be more about failure than success, a race to beat your friends that will often felt to these young people like a no-win situation. And as Pretty pointed out, you feel bad if you do a lot better than your friends because you've shown them up and they think you're a geek. And you feel bad if you do badly because you've let yourself down. And part of the systemic problem here is the subjects and activities they enjoyed and often excelled at had little status and recognition within the current English educational system. And this failure within education to respect and value working class knowledge has exacerbated the invidious divide between vocational and academic knowledge. And vocational education has a long history of stigmatisation in the UK, stereotyped and devalued as education desired by and more suitable for children of the working classes. As a result, in Britain, it's always approximated to what Dewey calls narrow technical trade education for specialised callings, carried on under the control of others, a restricted, theoretical type of apprenticeship. And unsurprisingly, attempts to upgrade vocational education has failed because the British middle classes have never considered it appropriate education for their own children. So any sort of parity between vocational and academic education would require a transformation of both what vocational education constitutes and who engages in it. But I would argue a key consequence of the low status of vocational education and its avoidance by the middle classes is yet another form of educational exclusion of the working classes that contributes to their early school leaving. Another concept from Bourdieu that I've used extensively to understand how educational institutions operate to exclude and fail working class young people is that of institutional habitus. An institutional habitus is the impact of a cultural group or social class on individual behaviour as it's mediated through an organisation. And as well as organisational features, it includes school ethos and culture. And what we increasingly have in the UK are schools that are universally seen to be rubbish and no good. Many working class children, particularly in urban areas, are going to schools that are not seen to be good enough for middle class children, what I referred to earlier as demonised schools. And these schools often have common organisational features that, despite the best intentions of the teachers, work against working class educational success. They emphasise discipline and behaviour, often at the expense of school engagement and interesting learning experiences. And the curriculum arrangements are also very different those in more middle-class schools. So research from 2015 found that the curriculum taught to children in poorer parts of Britain is significantly different to that taught in wealthier areas, reducing the educational opportunities for working class children. External pressures to achieve achievement levels in these predominantly working class schools has resulted in a preoccupation with testing and assessment that has turned education into a punishment, as working class children are drilled in the 3 R's in order to improve the school's league table position. In a misplaced effort to control and police student behaviour, they have an excess of rules and regulations that are seldom found in more mixed or middle-class schools, and a culture that emphasises control and regulation rather than creativity and curiosity. So, we have the identification of a significant number of inner-city schools and their students as the untouchables of the educational system. And this works to discriminate between non-problematic selves and problematic others. And the denial of understandings through which positive identifications can develop too often generates negatively framed and defensive identities expressed through shame, disavowal and disidentification. Identities that are seen by others to be rough and repellent can result in lots of our working class students exiting from the educational system as soon as they can. So, to summarise, Bourdieu's tools of capital, field, habitus and institutional habitus are useful in understanding early school leaving, but so also are his concepts of symbolic violence and symbolic domination. And more widely, notions of the impossible learner and Goffman's concept of the spoiled identity also have conceptual leverage. I'm going to talk now briefly about methodological challenges in interviewing working class young people who are seen to be failing educationally. And I would argue it's always challenging for privileged academics to establish rapport with young, often disaffected working class students. And the main questions I deployed in engaging my working class young informants in discussing their lives have been: what has happened in your life? What is going on in your life now? And what have been the circumstances that have got you here? What's got in the way of you staying at school? And above all, what needs to be different? And it's really difficult doing work on early school leaving without constructing the working classes as inadequate, as failures in some ways. That's why concepts such as institutional habitus are helpful. They focus our attention on the part schools play in early school leaving. But it's also why relational approaches are necessary. Working class responses and reactions to the education they receive are as much about the attitudes and practices of the upper and the middle classes as they are about working class dispositions. And I found Michelle Fine and her colleagues' questions to keep in mind really useful. So, have I connected the voices and stories of individuals back to the set of historic, structural and economic contexts in which they're situated? And have I considered how these data could be used for progressive, conservative and repressive social policies? And to what extent has my analysis offered an alternative to the common sense or dominant discourse? And how far do I want to go with respect to theorising the words of informants? Do I want to bury them in theory? And have I described the mundane? But just as I've used Bourdieu's concepts when theorising working class exclusions in education, so I've learned from his insights into methodology and research methods. And in his final chapter, In the Weight of the World, Bourdieu writes about non-violent communication and interviewing as a spiritual exercise. He writes about situating yourself in the place the respondents occupy in the social space, in order to understand them as necessarily what they are. And for Bourdieu, this involves giving oneself a genetic comprehension of who these individuals are, based on a theoretical and practical grasp of the conditions of which they are the product. This means a grasp of the circumstances of life and the social mechanisms that affect the entire category to which any individual belongs, and a grasp of the conditions inseparably psychological and social associated with a given position and trajectory in social space. And for me, this involves trying to empty your head, to lose your ego, and above all, to be humble in order to focus totally on the respondent and what they have to tell you. What Bourdieu calls an attentiveness to others and a self-abnegation and openness rarely encountered in everyday life. As Bourdieu insists, such understanding cannot be reduced to a sympathetic predisposition. You need to know and understand as much as possible about the respondent's circumstances, but to not allow that to result in any assumptions about who they are and what they might tell you. So Bourdieu says the interview can be considered a sort of spiritual exercise that through forgetfulness of the self aims at a true conversion of the way we look at other people in the ordinary circumstances of life. And I agree with Bourdieu. We should strive in the interview situation to create the rapport, empathy, love even, to allow our respondents to engage in what he calls an induced and accompanied self-analysis. And I want to end with a quote from Bourdieu outlining what happens when a mixture of our self-effacement, extremely hard work and good luck enables this to happen. Certain respondents, especially the most disadvantaged, seem to grasp this situation as an exceptional opportunity offered to them to testify, to make themselves heard, to carry their experience over from the private to the public sphere. An opportunity also to explain themselves in the fullest sense of the term. That is, to construct their own point of view, both about themselves and about the world, and to bring into the open the point within this world from which they see themselves, and the world becomes comprehensible and justified, not least for themselves. And eliciting these voices with clarity and authenticity is really important if we are to counter the dominant discourses on early school leaving. Thank you.
Okay, it's all right. Thank you very much, Diane. Now we have time for questions and debate, but before giving you the space for doing so, I would like to say some words. First of all, I know most of you know her, but I wanted to tell that at the beginning and I didn't. Diane Reay is Professor of Education at Cambridge University, and she is one of the most renowned sociologists working in the area of education. It is a big honor to have her today here, because in fact her work was the very inspiration for the ABJOVES project. So we have been reading her research during these 3 years, and it is a big pleasure to share with her this conference. I would like to say that her presentation was not only of big interest by itself, but also because it serves as the global framework for our conferences on the one hand, because of her impressive combination of theories, discourses, and also methodological concerns, as Xavier Bonal was pointed out at the beginning of the conference, and also because for her ability to combine in one presentation aspects related to policies, institutions, and subjects. And this is easy to say, but not always easy to apply in current research. And I would like also to highlight two other elements. I think that Diane Reay presentation show two of the main constants of her research, I would say. On the one hand, this focus on social inequalities in order to analyze and understand education, and especially this involvement in the construction of a social justice agenda. In fact, I would say, and I hope you agree with me, that Diane Reay is not only a brilliant academic, but also a social activist with a strong commitment in the identification, analysis, and denounce of the multiple mechanisms of social reproduction facing our society in general and the educational systems in particular. And in fact, talking about social class in a very individualized society is not always so common as it should be. And on the other hand, I would say that her research, her presentation today, but all her projects and publications show an impressive combination between the macro and the micro, the structures and the subjectivities. And in her analysis, and today it was very clear, she showed us how the social structures are perceived, experienced, and lived by the individuals, thus attributing a key roles to emotions and sentiments in doing sociological research. And again, this is not so common in our academy. So thank you again very much, Diane, for being here and for your impressive work. Now, okay. So maybe we can do 2-3 questions together and then answers. Xavier Rambla, there.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I would just like to ask a question about the change, about to what extent your past research found out some hints of change, to what extent is social reproduction interrupted in some cases.
Yes.
If sometimes public policies, education policies, are successful in overcoming the circumstances of seeing schools or other possible changes that may interrupt this social reproduction. Thank you.
Maybe before the questions, you could say your name and maybe your position. It would be easy also for knowing each other.
Xavier Rambla, Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. Sorry.
Another one. Yeah. Yes.
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that on the surface and in policy terms, a lot seems to have changed. We're talking about early school leaving, but in the UK, increasing numbers of working class young people are going to university, and we have one of the highest levels of percentage of the age cohort going on to university. So we've got lots of working class young people now in our universities, but as they moved on into the university sector, so that sector's become more segregated, segmented, hierarchical, and they are still outsiders on the inside within the field of higher education. And we have a real problem with not so much graduate unemployment, but the fact that a lot of these working class young people are leaving universities and going into non-graduate jobs. So they're ending up in the same jobs they would probably have been in at, you know, if they left school at 16, 18, but with debts of over £50,000. So, I mean, it's interesting because I think, you know, that's why I love Bourdieu, because Habitus is, you know, about, we're all agentic, you know, we all have agency. And when you talk to young working class people, they've got a powerful sense of their own agency. There's not very much fatalism, except at the very bottom sets, where they've had extremely negative experiences. On the whole, they've got a very strong sense of what is possible and what they can do. But the social exclusions are still there, they're just at a higher level of the educational system.
More questions? You were talking about the common organizational features of some of the segregated schools in where you have been working. But I would like to ask you if you identified some tensions and contradictions in the case of teachers, as if you do in the case of students. I mean, not all teachers assume or react to the same organizational structures. So you can.
I think it's very, very hard for teachers in English education at the moment. I mean, which is I've been quite emotional about it. I did some interviewing with teachers last year, and quite a number of them cried. You know, 15 years ago, you would interview teachers; they didn't cry. And I think that we have a forced program of making all our schools into academies. A lot of teachers are very committed to being in state-run schools. And what comes with this forced policy of making schools academies is they get rebranded. So there's often a big focus on uniform, promoting a particular sort of educational image brand. And lots of regulations and rules, and also what happens is so they've got a very, very identifiable institutional habitus, these schools. But what's also come with academies is that no longer national conditions of work apply. So teachers can be casualised. They've no longer got secure employment, their contracts can be changed, they're employed by a sort of semi-private organisation that runs, there's lots of academy chains, and some of them are run by businessmen, entrepreneurs, as well as charities. And so there's a very strong sense, I think, in schools that there's this neoliberal tide that they're very powerless to be able to change. I mean, that's not all teachers. Some teachers are welcoming the changes, but on the whole, they and their unions are not. And when I started teaching at the beginning of the 1970s in a London primary school. You know, teachers became teachers for life. You know, I still have a whole group of friends who are still in those schools in London. Now the average length of time teachers stay in teaching is less than 5 years. We have no continuity. And of course that has a big impact on the institutional habitus too. So teachers are feeling very much that their professional identity is under threat in the UK.
Very important. In fact, here in the room there are teachers, supervisors, etc. I will give you the word now, but I would like to ask you, if you like to, the people who is here working in the schools, how they feel this situation that Diane was explaining us. These contradictions of teaching students from different social origins, and also the tensions of maybe not being able to achieve what is expected because of the organizational features, the budget budget constraints, etc.
Yes.
So, just putting the floor. Is there a question?
Yeah, thank you. Marcel Javier Mojarado. I'm from the University of Münster in Germany. Let me start by thanking you for including institutional, vertical, individual perspectives into your presentation today. There is one mention I wanted to point out, at least that I sense in the presentation, is at the discursive level. And this refers to another set of tensions between research and policy making. As I see, policy takes up and adopts much of the categories used in research. And it might also be that there is something related to different academic cultures and the way social categories are used for sociological analysis, and how we use in our research the same set of socially produced categories to describe and depict the people whom we're working with. In your presentation, I was amazed by the number of attributes that sometimes are defined and used in by different ways. And I see some tension in that. And I also see you pointed out to the methodological challenges related to this. And, so we're more or less damned if we do, and damned if we don't use the same categories to work. But do you see any, do you see the tension I'm pointing out to? Can you comment on this? Because I see it especially trying to transfer research into policy and give input into policy making. This creates a tension that's, I feel it, I'm very uneasy with that. That's why. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really interesting point to make. I mean, I think that the UK and England in particular is a particularly sort of interesting case study. I mean, I think unlike other European countries, we've had a real excess of policy. And a real excess of policy that even the policymakers see is not working. And the response to the policies not working is to come up with even more policies that still don't work. And I think the other very specific issue in relation to the UK is that we've just let the gap between the poor and the rich grow and grow and grow. And in fact, that's having a really negative impact on our educational system, because as the poor become poorer and more different from the reasonably well-off and the affluent, those latter groups are even less likely to want their children to go to school with groups that they see as, you know, very likely to pull their own children's learning back. And yet we still have a very strong focus on choice and a valorising of choice in the UK, when it's quite obvious that we've now got to a situation where our poorer, more disadvantaged students just have the choices that the more affluent and privileged families don't want. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's fair. I spend a lot of time in Nordic countries, in Finland, and I think there that they find it quite difficult to comprehend how, our policy responses to the situations in our school. I mean, I don't know if people realise as well that we've stopped a major building programme. So a lot of our schools are particularly in poor areas, are in serious disrepair and under-resourced. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to emphasise how specific a case English education is, and I hope it stays a specific case. Please don't copy any of our policies.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really fascinating. My question is related to issues about how to transfer this type of research to actors and policymakers.
Yeah.
So I think this type of research is not just important for, as I said in my introduction, for policymakers, but also essentially important for teachers.
Yeah.
Because my impression is that we teachers don't manage this type of sociological type of approach.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the main shortcomings of teachers, at least in our education system. So, what is your experience in trying to transfer this type of, for instance, the Sean story? I find it fascinating from the point of view of the tensions between social class and gender. His masculinity also is involved in that, and how teachers can recognize this type of categories in their reading of the students.
Yeah, I do go to schools and talk quite a lot, but I'm starting to work with, there's only 2 academics and there's about 15 people in this group, mainly teachers, head teachers, activists, and we're called Turning the Tide, although we haven't managed to turn in time yet. But, so I've written a letter to English school children, trying to make it very clear and concise what I see as the problems. And that also includes what's going on with teachers, because I think, you know, English teachers they're worried, they're weary, they're worn out. And I think that often the young people don't realise how difficult the policies are for their teachers. They know that they're being tested all the time, but they don't realise the repercussions for teachers too. So we've just started doing that, and we've done it with some London schools, and the kids have been really great, very receptive. You know, we've looked at privileged kids and kids from very poor disadvantaged backgrounds. The difference is that the kids from poor disadvantaged backgrounds are very angry about what's going on, and when you get them to respond and have a discussion with them, a lot of anger comes out, quite rightly, I think. But I mean, the interesting thing is that the policies are making all our children unhappy. So the well-being levels in English schools are very, very low. Probably most recent survey, we were below Ethiopia, Poland, Latvia, in terms of our children's sense of well-being in school. And particularly low in terms of their relationship with teachers. I think because teachers don't have time to spend with students in the way they do. So we've done that, and next week I'm going to go to Norfolk and work with some schools in poor rural areas, with some of these people on this group, mostly retired. We're all mostly retired head teachers, activists, but then, you know, teachers who are working full time haven't got time to do this sort of work. So yeah, so that's one thing we're trying to do, not just engage teachers, but engage students as well. But the problem is then when you produce some sort of document that you want to give to the policymakers, they're very unlikely to take any notice. I mean, our problem is, and I think I said that in the talk, that they're ideologically committed to restructuring the educational system and re-traditionalising the curriculum. And of course, they haven't sent their own children to the state sector. Their children have mostly been educated, and they themselves have been educated in the private system. So it's very difficult to get them to engage in any sort of passionate, authentic way with what's going on with poor children in schools in the UK.
If someone would like to ask a question in Spanish, it's possible.
Yo mismo. Me llamo Andrés Iglesias y soy técnico de educación del Ayuntamiento de Sevilla. Agradecer la invitación de que hayamos podido venir a este seminario internacional, porque nosotros desde Ciudades Educadoras estamos trabajando también en el tema de la prevención del absentismo, abandono escolar y también sobre el tema del éxito escolar. Me acompaña también aquí Rafael del Ayuntamiento de Málaga y somos 19 ciudades que estamos trabajando en ese ámbito a nivel estatal. Y me ha parecido muy interesante su intervención, porque normalmente cuando acudimos a intervenciones de temas de investigación nos hablan de los grandes consensos, pero su intervención ha bajado al terreno. Y en ese sentido yo me he quedado con cosas muy interesantes, como que se intenta en los colegios, desde el punto de vista de los colegios, se intenta ver el problema más desde el punto de vista del fracaso que del éxito, de buscar el acompañamiento de lo que nosotros llamamos la comunidad educativa, el problema de esos alumnos inaudibles, es decir, qué papel cumple el profesorado, porque el profesorado últimamente también en nuestro país, pues sobre todo el profesorado de secundaria, pues tiene la concepción de que son más instructores y no deben de ser yo desde mi punto de vista solo instructores, sino que también tienen que ser educadores, porque los valores y la educación lo tienen que impregnar todo. Y en ese sentido me gustaría preguntarle dos cosas. En parte le han hecho ya la pregunta: ¿qué papel juega el profesorado o el movimiento de los profesores y profesoras en el Reino Unido? ¿Y qué papel juegan las instituciones locales, los ayuntamientos, dentro del Reino Unido? Porque igual que se ha puesto ejemplos, yo le puedo poner también un ejemplo de nosotros a través de un ámbito de participación, pues dentro de nuestras ciudades, dentro de nuestra comunidad autónoma, hay una política definida sobre zonas que nosotros llamamos de necesidades de transformación social. Y dentro de estas zonas, en mi ciudad, se llevó un programa durante 9 años de refuerzo escolar que se daba por las tardes y partía de la voluntad de los propios profesores de los centros en zonas que tienen unos altísimos índices de asentismo y como consecuencia pues después de abandono escolar. Y por la confluencia de esa voluntad del profesorado, durante esos 9 años que estuvo implementado ese programa en 8 centros de la ciudad de Sevilla, pues se vio que incluso alumnos que por la mañana en las clases normales eran inaudibles
thank you. That's a really important question, because we have a real problem in the UK at the moment with our local authorities ran our schools, and for the most part ran them really well. When I started teaching, I was a member of what was called the Inner London Educational Authority, and we were starting to do some brilliant work in relation to race, gender, class, and there was a real value in it being geographically located, but large enough and well funded enough to do some important innovative work. And then the Tory, our Conservative government, decided they didn't want it anymore. We actually had a democratic vote. 98% of people in London voted to keep it, and they abolished it anyway. And now our local authorities are really under threat. And that's the government policy is to encourage all schools to become autonomous, to either be governed by these academy chains, which are semi-private, and so those very progressive organisations, which is what the local authorities were, are being eroded, and their powers really cut back, and other people are coming in and governing our school system from the private sector. A recent policy change was that parents can no longer be governors on school governing bodies. You need to have entrepreneurial skills. So parent governors, who were a really progressive force on the whole, are going to be replaced by people with skills from the private sector. So it's all part of this privatisation of schools. And the teacher unions have started to take a voice in relation to that. But our trade union legislation in England has been so damaging and has so eroded the power of unions like the teaching union that it's very difficult for teachers to have a collective voice. So yeah, it's difficult, and I think that it's very clear that the educational system in England has been set up for privatisation. And at the moment, schools can't be run for a profit. But I would be worried that before long, that's what will happen. And so those really progressive institutions that did have a voice, and they made mistakes, they weren't brilliant, but they were democratic. And what we've lost with those institutions is, both on the union side and the local authority side, is really any strong democracy within our educational system. But maybe our government will change, and we might get some more progressive policies.
I have a question about what you said about students from lower social class background, that they're really angry sometimes, and I think they're also often separated across schools, so they're really highly segregated. But what I see in Belgium is that many students from middle class background, they're really not aware of those students that are angry, as they're not really aware of their own position, and how I often read many scholars from the UK, they're often more critical against those social backgrounds of the students, but how do the students themselves reflect upon, the middle class students reflect upon their own social background? Do they really think of it? Do they reflect upon it, or not? Because even the students from a lower social background in Belgium, they're angry but they cannot really express themselves, I think, because it's so neglected that there is actually no debate between nature.
I mean, it's difficult in the UK too, because we don't really have a strong class discourse. There's a denial of class. And so we get someone like our Prime Minister, who's a multi-millionaire, went to Eton and Oxford, talking about just being an ordinary middle-class guy. And he's not. But I teach at Cambridge, and I think it's really interesting there because there's a denial of privilege. I mean, why wouldn't you deny it? Actually, if you own your privilege, and the fact that you are so much better off than other people, and you are monopolising all the resources that really should be shared more equally in society. I can see that strategically that the thing is to deny privilege, just to say you're some ordinary guy like everybody else. But we are doing that in the UK still against the backdrop where, as I say, the rich are getting even richer and the poor are getting even poorer. And that denial is going to cause more and more anger, I think, from people at the bottom who are seeing that, that it's not just in education, there's no more social housing for them. We are having a crisis in terms of our housing. And the rental market in London the rents are astronomical. And when I moved into, I live in like a poor area of London, and when I moved there in the 1970s, there was incredible overcrowding. 5, 7, 8 families living in a small terraced house. And then all that changed, but now we have that again. Except that this time they're paying very high rents just to be in this really overcrowded housing. So it's not just the educational system, the inequalities are across all social fields. So I think this denial of privilege is a moral lack, actually, I think. It's a moral lack. I think that, and it's very, very, very pervasive in Cambridge. The students do not think. Well, it's because of neoliberal individualisation and the dominant neoliberal discourses. Give them a letter. They're there because they're brilliant. I've taught in lots of universities in the UK. When I got to Cambridge, I was very surprised and shocked because everyone there was brilliant. And now I'm there, so that's really wonderful, so I can be brilliant too. But the sense that you're there because you're better than other people, intellectually brilliant, and they are not, that is the dominant discourse. They think they're there because they deserve to be there, not because they've had so many more resources put into their education. And it's interesting. I have some very interesting discussions with my students because they're very resistant. They're very resistant to owning their privilege. They are there because they are very, very, very clever. And they work really, really hard as well. And their families are just ordinary families. And I try and say, well, the average wage in the UK is about 25,000. This is sterling. These people, their families are on 4, 5, 6 times that amount of money. But still it's a big problem.
So we have time for 1 or 2 questions more, maximum.
Yes, Richard. Marta Karan from Reay, and it's very related to Lauren's question. I wanted to ask you this neoliberal, this dominant discourse that there's a denial of social class. What did you find in your research and teachers? The teachers, if they were aware, did they recognize? Because in our study we found that like an omission, a denial of social class. They weren't aware, and not just social class, but also gender. I wanted to ask you if your teachers, they were aware of the reproduction of the stereotype patterns in their organizational practices, guidance practices, because they were aware that...
Yeah. I think it's interesting. I think that historically in the UK, a lot of teachers have come from working class and lower middle class backgrounds. So it was a profession, a job that attracted the socially mobile. So certainly when I was working in the ILEA in the 70s and 80s, there was quite a strong discourse about class, and often it got constructed as a compensatory discourse. So it's still about a lack in working class cultures, but I think there was a recognition that working class children were missing out and needed to be given extra resources. And at that time, the policies did give extra resources to working class schools, but that's changed now. I mean, I think some of the younger teachers, because our recruitment's different, we have teach first. There was a sense that our educational system was failing, so it needed brilliant teachers. But actually, it didn't really mean brilliant. It meant brilliant, academically able teachers. So there was a heavy attempt to recruit from the elite universities, Cambridge, Oxford. So that policy made a big change in terms of the composition of younger teachers in our schools. So they're from Oxbridge and other elite universities, and their class, they're not so aware class. They've got a feeling that children just need to be encouraged enough and work hard enough, and then that will all be fine. So there has been a shift over time. In terms of gender, I think it's really interesting. I think, well, it's not just about the white working classes, it's about black working class boys as well. And I think it's very difficult there to unravel actually a fear of the male and the black other. And I don't know about Spanish schools, but it's mostly women in our schools, increasingly so. So yeah, I think there are problematic areas around both gender and class that have been really helpful actually if our teacher education had allowed for some sociology or some sociology there. I had a brilliant, I did it 1 year after university, but I had a great PGCE where there was a lot of sociology there as well as psychology. Now our trainees get psychology, they get individualised sort of analyses of what goes on in classrooms, and no sociology of ed. And I think that is really difficult because then they're not aware often. They don't think in class or in gender terms. And I think that's the repercussions are then suffered by the students.
So, last one.
Right, thank you. Maria Chalana from the University of York. I'm doing my research on higher education. It's pretty much the same.
Yeah.
And one of the findings I got is that students who manage to persist are those who decided at an early stage to change friends.
Okay.
I noticed from your case that students have this struggle because friends are part of their identity.
Yeah.
And these students say this is a price to pay.
Yeah.
And it's something that represents less of a challenge for a change for 3 reasons. It's free of charge financially, and it's decided by the student, and it follows the discourse of the student and not the discourse of the institution. Or the teachers, who are usually reluctant to change. My question is, has that been ever discussed as a possible approach in other levels of education, like approaching the possibility of changing friends?
Yes, I think friends are really, really important. I mean, from Paul Willis and his lads to, Sean's example, he didn't want to stand out from his friends. But I think it's the problem in our schools is that was fine when we had more mixed schools. I think still in rural areas, where people don't have choice of school, you get working class, middle class children from all backgrounds together. I think the problem now is that even in our inner city areas, when there is more of a social mix, the children are all set. So that the white, middle class, more privileged children are in the top sets, and the less privileged children in the bottom sets, and then it's difficult to get friendships across sets. I think that making friends across difference and encouraging that in primary schools is something we did all the time in the INEA. It was seen as very positive and to be encouraged, but you need to have a mixture in your classes first in order to do that. And I think that's what we're losing, particularly in our urban areas.
I guess it would have to be done through something different than academic, because they are grouped through the academic.
Yes, yeah. You'd have to have middle class children doing more vocational subjects for a start. You'd have to have stop setting in maths and science, and we set nearly all our subjects once they get to secondary school in some of our schools, particularly the academies. So, I think it's a good policy. And you're right, it's a sort of fairly straightforward, simple one, but it needs the right conditions for it to work.
Okay, so before you all run away, let me tell you just 3 things. First of all, thank you very much again, not only for the brilliant lecture, but also for a very stimulating debate. It was very interesting. And now just 2 organizational elements. First of all, now there's the coffee break here in the hall. We will start again at 11:30 with the panel sessions, okay? You have all the invitations in the program, but in the case you get lost or whatever, all the organizing committee here in the first row and also the men and women in red can help you in everything. Last thing, our hashtag for Twitter is Seminario ABJOVES.